Once upon a time, film was not art. At least, it wasn't seen as such. It was seen by many as just a fun distraction, something that, while advanced and mind-blowing for the time, wasn't anything beyond that.
Film initially suffered from the same ontological problem as photography. When it came on the scene, it was a mechanical recording of reality. So in this way, both film and photography were seen to not be art.
Films were viewed as having so little lasting worth to them that there was barely any effort made to preserve them, and many films have been lost to the ages as they deteriorated beyond repair. In fact, some film studios would often melt down their films after showing them to save space and storage costs, because they were just films, and many thought that they would never matter. But the world bore witness to the work of Orson Welles. Suddenly, the population started wondering if film could be more than just a fun set of moving pictures. We continued to explore this idea with the films of Sergio Leone, Stanley Kubrick, Steven Spielberg, creators who came up with films that made us feel excitement, fear, joy, suspense, all through the format of film. They made us realize the artistic capability that the medium holds, and even the films that were once seen as simple distractions are now being analyzed and taught about to this day. Today, that trend is happening again, albeit in a different medium. That medium is video games. It is difficult to pin down when exactly the first video game was made. Some say it was the limited release of Space War back in 1962. Others say it was Pong back in 1972. Regardless of when the true creation of video games was, it was never even thought of at the time that these things could be seen as art. Even as time went on and more people started considering this, there were still many who said that they were too simple, too mindless. But in order to figure out what is and isn't art, we must first ask, what is art?
Art really breaks down to three things for me. It's something that we examine, admire, and learn from.
I would say that art is anything that combines human creativity with, to some degree, effort.
I would personally define art as something that is created with the goal of eliciting a reaction, particularly an emotional one, from a person.
Personally, I would define it as anything that has beauty and requires skill.
Art is just a form of expression that people use to describe how they're feeling at the time. At least that's just how I described it, or that's what I felt like it was.
I turned to the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary, and the one probably most applicable is the following. Art is the expression or application of creative skill and imagination, typically in a visual form such as painting, drawing, or sculpture, producing works to be appreciated primarily for their beauty or emotional power.
This seems like a broad definition, as it technically defines any visual creation as art in some way. But from this definition, we can infer that what society views as valuable art is based on the value of its beauty and emotional power.
The idea of important works is a construction, right? It's a creation. And the idea of a canon and the importance to a canon is developed by consensus.
Anybody can make something, like they can make a sandwich, but that's not really creative, it's just a functional task.
All media has found their own ways of creating this beauty and emotional power. Literature with masterful writing techniques, dance with unparalleled agility and grace, music with beautiful arrangements of sound. There is also media that incorporates techniques from a variety of others, film being a notable example, with arranging scene placement, musical accompaniment, acting talent, and many others, while still having their own important identity that makes them irreplaceable. It is clear to the common observer that the video game is another medium that incorporates a variety of techniques, as it uses things such as music, art direction, and even writing. But beyond all this, it uses another element that is completely unique to the medium. That technique is player participation.
The appeal of that is you're basically controlling what you're seeing on the screen. So if you're playing this form of entertainment and you somewhat have control over it, it's not like you're watching a film where you can change the plot if you don't like it.
When we experience a film, a book, or a play, we take on the role of an observer. We are taking in the concepts presented to us as outsiders looking in, seeing these artistic presentations run their constructed course. Video games, however, require the audience to not merely stand by and watch, but to take part in the unfolding of the story and experience what is happening from the role of an active participant.
Ultimately, what it boils down to with video games is that, like, at the end of the day, like, the player is the one who's, like, responsible for the stuff happening, and, like, if you give them choices, a lot more interesting things can happen, and they'll feel a lot more connected as a result.
Even on an extremely small scale, a video game has always been about making decisions that will change the outcome of what you're going through, whether that outcome is a horribly important emotional moral choice like in The Walking Dead, or if it's something simple like move to the left or you will die, or move to the right or you will not get a high score, as in the arcade days.
Of course, choice is not the only thing that makes a video game click with people. Though it is the unique aspect, there are aspects from other art forms that factor into it as well. It is important to remember that games, like any other medium, are heavily dependent on their presentation. It is difficult to imagine games like Overwatch or Team Fortress 2 without their art styles, or if the characters in Bioshock or Dawn of War sounded any different. Changing even the slightest elements in these things could drastically alter the overall product, as well as the way the audience experienced them. Imagine Superman without his iconic suit, or Mickey Mouse without his ears. Actually, let's take a moment to talk about a character just as iconic as either of them, Pac-Man.
If I had to describe Pac-Man in a single word, it'd be fun. The sound effects, the ghosts, the character design of Pac-Man himself, all of it screams, have fun.
I really like learning random little trivia details about Pac-Man. 2 of the ghosts are programmed in a way that one of them will follow you and one of them will actually avoid you. Those are actually the very first video game enemies that were given some degree of AI.
According to the Dave Brown Index, Pac-Man has the highest brand recognition among American consumers of any video game character, at 94%. His original game, released in 1980, was one of the most successful arcade games of all time, grossing $2.5 billion in quarters by 1990. His legacy isn't limited to just video games either. He was the first video game character to have a spin-off cartoon, and even inspired a pop song titled Pac-Man Fever in March 1982. Now, imagine any of this without his iconic design. The game, the merchandise, all of it without his look. Doing so is likely pretty challenging. Making any long-lasting character requires a good design, something that will immediately pop into people's heads when they say the name. It needs to leave a long-lasting impression on those who see it, exactly what art is intended to do. The art style of Pac-Man works to its favor just like the art style of something like the Super Mario series.
One of actually the top video game characters, which is Mario, was originated in Donkey Kong. That's actually in that first game, he's called Jumpman, but that was the first time that character was appeared in the video game series.
Super Mario World, for example, released in 1990, is a game with a very distinct aesthetic to it. The art style, the character models, and graphics all work with each other to establish the fun, cheery tone of the game. Can you imagine any of what is being shown if the colors looked a little duller, or if the music genre was different? It would be like imagining Casablanca with more modernized slang, or The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly with a much different soundtrack. Mario, of course, was well known and well established before this game, but this was the first one that really set in things like his shirt and his hat being bright red, as well as the appearance of his dinosaur steed Yoshi. These characters have become widely recognized across the world as well, and it's largely thanks to the art style that they have become so distinct.
Style is everything. I mean, everybody wants to have their personal stamp on something.
Whether it's the original 2D Super Mario titles or any of the 3D titles, the Mario games have had a huge role in my life.
Been part of my life since I started playing video games. Paper Mario was the first RPG I really got into.
That's not to say nothing is owed to the previous installments, of course. The original Super Mario Bros. Established Mario's appearance, the enemies he fought, the power-ups he used, and of course the iconic theme song.
As more Mario games come out, people always look back to where Mario started. No matter how many Mario games come out, people always know that's the first one.
Mario's theme song is not only one of the most famous themes in video game history, it is one of the most famous themes in any franchise. When Super Mario Bros. First came out, there were not many games that had recognizable music beyond jingles that lasted for only a few seconds. Ever since its release, however, video game soundtracks have been expected to contain whole libraries of unique, creative music that is meant to fit the story and action just as the soundtrack to any movie or play would. The 1994 role-playing game Final Fantasy VI, for example, has a soundtrack reminiscent of a narrative orchestra. It uses a variety of instruments and motifs to create music that practically make the story feel like a centuries-old epic. Each character, location, and event has its own theme, and each song is carefully crafted to make sure it fits what it represents. Arguably the most famous track is Dancing Mad, a grand 10-minute piece that represents the final struggle against Final Fantasy VI's main villain. Shadow of the Colossus, released in 2005, also has an orchestral soundtrack, but this one is used for a much more different effect. Whereas Final Fantasy VI's soundtrack had the tone of a grand epic, Shadow of the Colossus feels more like a classic tragedy. The slower, calmer pieces seem to suggest an air of hopelessness and dread, and even the grand songs have an overwhelming sense of peril and danger to them. The 2007 game No More Heroes draws its musical use from a whole different bag. The soundtrack contains a big assortment of rock, hip-hop, EDM, and other genres meant to give a vibe of creative madness. Being a game with over-the-top violence and quirky humor, the music serves to bring the audience into this world of insanity. Like with all art forms that incorporate a variety of other media, such as television and film, the art style and soundtrack of these games build to one overall aesthetic meant to serve the worlds that they take place in. The fact that so many people know about the Mushroom Kingdom and the characters that inhabit it means that it succeeded in creating a long-lasting impact with a lot of people, just as much as something like Middle-earth or Mount Olympus. In fact, it isn't even the only one. There's another video game world that's also stuck out in the minds of a lot of people over the years, though it serves a much different aesthetic and purpose. That would be the world of Rapture.
At its surface, Bioshock is a gorgeous game, with the underwater city of Rapture as its backdrop. As I've been playing, I've been glancing at the 30s Art Deco style of the game, and admired it. But in the gameplay, that admiration is suddenly just ripped away, and I can see how it's all just unraveled.
I love the environment. I love how all of the action technically has already happened before you came in, and instead of you playing through it like in most other games, you go through this completely dead world or almost dead world and find little bits and pieces that tell you the story of everything that happened before you got to this world. And there's no hope for saving it, but with luck you can save the tiny remains of what is left.
To change the design and atmosphere it creates would mess with the world Bioshock creates way too much, and may even detract from the message it delivers using the interactivity that makes games unique. As the player explores the ruined, hostile city of Rapture, they are slowly made to feel in control again through their journey. The once oppressive atmosphere seems a lot less intimidating once you've gotten the hang of fighting back the depraved lunatics that haunt it, as well as acquired more weapons and powers. But in a famous twist, the main villain reveals that you never had a choice at all. Every goal you pursued in your fight for survival was instructed to you by a man whose real name you never even knew. Yet the player followed willingly, while tricking themselves into thinking it was all on their own. This twist would have already been shocking in another storytelling format, but it's made much more powerful when the player puts themselves in the role and is made to think that they themselves are making these choices. Once again, very few can imagine it being delivered as strongly without the dark atmosphere and unique world of Rapture.
If one is talking about what is maybe more interesting or more worthy of further discussion, then the style certainly plays a role in that to differentiate the product from all the rest.
Bioshock isn't the only game to play around with the illusion of choice. Another game that is often cited as a crowning achievement of interactivity-based storytelling is the Stanley Parable.
The Stanley Parable doesn't have a single genre, in my opinion. It's just a game that stands on its own.
I feel like it's one of those games that you need to play. It's nothing like super complicated, so even if like you're not super into video games, it's still something that you can get into.
A few years ago, I was in a class specifically for teaching us about how narratives work in video games. On one of the classes, he put up a projector and he started playing Stanley Parable in front of the whole class. For the first couple of minutes, we just sat there and laughed at the funny commentator and how amazingly well casted he was. But then as the game went on, we could feel all of us collectively seeing how we understood video games just fall apart right in front of our eyes.
It's interesting in its narrative, in which the story changes depending on how you listen to the narrator. When I first played it at a friend's, I got the ending where Stanley went mad and ended his own life. When the title screen returned, I stared at it and I thought, what did I just play?
It's basically a video game, the video game about video games. The first ending he got to was the normal ending, where you follow all of the cues and get to the normal ending. The second route he went to was the apartment ending, where toward the end of the route, it basically broke down every single action you ever take in a video game as just pressing buttons when the game tells you to. And seeing it stripped down to bare bones like that completely blew my mind. It simultaneously made me want to never play video games again in my life and only play video games for the rest of my life.
Choice can be used for both dramatic and humorous purposes, but it can also be used for horror and dread. Because of how video games require its audience to participate directly in what they're showing, they can sometimes be even more effective than a movie at scaring people. While characters making their own choices in a thrilling scenario can certainly be compelling, it still acts as a psychological barrier that prevents the audience from being fully engaged in the threats being portrayed. Since video games require people to place themselves in the role in the situation to participate and progress through it, that barrier is now removed. Toying with horror and scares in situations like this without those limitations has become so attractive to developers that the horror game has become its own genre, despite the categorization having seemingly little to do with the mechanics themselves. This is because the main reason why the player plays them and the focus put on the interactivity comes not from the gameplay, but from the psychological way that the player interacts with them. A horror game can have the facets of nearly any kind of genre out there, but the tension it instills in the player is the main reason why they play them.
I believe it's mostly attention building. Any kind of game where you're exploring some dark dungeon, things get ominous. You know first and foremost that that's because of the music that's playing.
The 2001 game Silent Hill 2 is a game with the mechanics and feel of an exploration-based adventure game, but its main appeal is the dark, brooding atmosphere it creates and the story it presents to the player. The game is about the internal struggles of a man who is haunted by the memories of his long-dead wife, and how these struggles materialize themselves in the form of a strange town filled with monsters based on his psychological state. It would have already been a strong story in any other format, but it is made even more compelling when it brings the audience into the role of the main character James Sunderland and puts them in charge of helping him explore the town of Silent Hill. We are made to feel his confusion and uncertainty for ourselves, as well as the danger he's in when he is confronted with one of the otherworldly creatures roaming around the town.
Its story is that of tragedy, and I've yet to see something else as unique as Silent Hill 2.
In a different vein, 2012's Spec Ops: The Line is a game purposefully meant to feel and look like a military shooter, but this is meant for subversive purposes. The gameplay and environment is modeled after that of popular mainstream games like Call of Duty, and does so with the intent of looking at the subject matter with a more serious and unsettling point of view. Unlike the Call of Duty series and other examples of media that take the topic of war and use it to let people live out a soldier-hero fantasy, Spec Ops: The Line is a deconstruction of such militarily patriotic experiences. It has many of the same interactive experiences as a typical war shooter, but calls into question the moral implications behind such actions. It gradually transforms from a shooter game into a horror, as the player and the characters commit more and more atrocious actions and the effects of PTSD start to wear heavy. Again, by having the audience be the one making the conscious decisions, they are brought directly into the consequences of what happens, making them feel the full weight of what they've done.
I personally think that the options of choices in games have opened up the way we see narratives, and even how game writers can write their narratives. The game that I think did it best was Undertale.
2015's Undertale is notorious for being a wildly different game based on the choices the player makes in it, revolving around one big continuous decision: fighting or sparing. Unlike most role-playing games which pit you against dangerous enemies with the expectation of eliminating them through violent means, Undertale offers the option of appealing to the creatures with kind and often silly actions, and then calling off the fight once they've been calmed down. The very existence of this choice in the game puts a lot more weight behind the combat. It is now entirely up to the player to decide whether or not the monsters they are fighting should live or die, and how they want to shape the world around them.
It is amazing how much that game got me to care in so little time, and continued to make me care all the way to the end. By the time I got to the end of the very first region of the game, I was already dead set on never hurting a single living creature in that game, even though I will always have the option to.
The game itself is beautifully crafted to not only examine old RPG tropes, but even make statements about humanity itself. At times, the game made me feel loved. I vowed to never play the genocide run, always going for the true pacifist ending.
Even though I know I'll never play the run once in my life just because of how much the game affected me, I still really, really respect the genocide route just because of how unrelentingly macabre it is. It's kind of the most violent game I've ever seen, even though there's hardly a drop of blood in it, just because every single thing that you do in that run, every single thing that you kill feels harsh. Every single character has to die for you to get that ending that you want so badly, so you can't at any point let up and at any point show mercy, as the game puts it.
The great thing about video games is that there's usually some kind of task or a goal or an accomplishment to maintain.
Undertale can almost be described as two games at once because of how different each route is, but it prevents this change from feeling jarring at all by placing all responsibility on the player themselves. They can only reach the game's best ending by sparing every single enemy in the game, and they can only achieve its worst ending by purposefully killing every single thing they come across until there is literally nothing left. Not only does the game world of Undertale change based on their choices, it changes massively by placing all responsibility on them to decide what to do. Of course, Undertale isn't the first game to use some of these ideas. Like with other art forms, video games often work with concepts that end up influencing the medium later on. The 1994 game Earthbound is often cited as a major precursor to Undertale, having not only a similar visual and writing style, but also mixing lighthearted humor and heartfelt emotion with disturbing imagery and unsettling plot elements.
Toby Fox, the man who made Undertale, he actually started his career by making ROM hacks of Earthbound that were really weird in hindsight, but you can still see some of the early breadcrumbs of what he'd later go on to be. And if you play either game before or after the other, the influence that Earthbound had on Undertale is all over the place. They're a very similar style. They have the same tongue-in-cheek, cartoonish nature a lot of the time.
Games such as Deus Ex, released in 2000, also allowed the player to spare enemies who could conventionally be killed long before Undertale, and both the world and characters also changed depending on who the player decided lived and died. However, Undertale is notable not for merely reusing the concepts from these games, but for combining them into a single experience and experimenting with them. These games were able to stand the test of time and influence the art form later on, because they were seen as significant enough in their medium to do so.
I think that firsts are oftentimes significant, and often works that exemplify mastery in some sense of that term. So either highly sophisticated use of form or mastery of all of the expressive capabilities. I think also works that are interrogations of the medium by the medium itself.
The quirky humor and dark imagery of Earthbound went on to influence the contrast between Undertale's pacifist and no mercy routes, just as the adventurous imagery of films like Secret Service and Darkest Africa went on to influence the bravado and thrills of Raiders of the Lost Ark, or how the blend of fantasy elements with sci-fi aesthetics and Flash Gordon continued to inspire the Star Wars films years later. The evolution of all media is shaped as more of it is made, and video games are no exception to this.
The biggest influence between Earthbound and Undertale is that Earthbound started this idea of creating a game that had a personal relationship with you. Partway through Earthbound, you enter your name into the game, and then later on, it will talk to you specifically in really important ways that got to people in a way that no other game had done at the time. But Undertale is probably, at the moment, the best game for that sort of story, just because of how absolutely all the way it goes.
While the idea of the whole player-driven narrative interspersing with the game was certainly a thing, Undertale really brought it into the limelight.
The artistic integrity that choice can hold may be easy to see in games where the worlds are more directly affected by these choices. But what about games where choice is restrained to more simple consequences, such as what weapon they use to eliminate an enemy? Is the value of choice reduced when its effects are smaller? Like with any art form, video games are an experience that the audience is expected to mentally give themselves to. Since player participation is the default of the genre, it is impossible for them to not experience the interactivity on some level. Just because the effects of their choices on the in-game world may be reduced, their significance is not. All of their choices are conclusions that they have reached with their own thought processes, and thus are reflective of the people making them. The 2016 game Doom seems like a game where the player choice has little significant meaning at a glance. The story progresses the same regardless of how the player goes about it, and there is not much personal customization beyond the weapon and ability upgrades. But the real significant choice the game presents are found in the gameplay itself. Each combat encounter of Doom thrusts the audience into a fast-paced, high-stress environment that forces them to either adapt to the intense action or die. Once the player has understood what kind of challenges the game will present them with, it is up to them to decide how to push through these challenges. When low on health with only 2 demons left in the room, do they sprint for the only health pickups left, or kill the demons first? If the demons in question are a pair of Hell Knights, bulky enemies with punishing close quarters attacks, how do they fight them? Do they risk close range and use the shotgun to try to take them out quickly? Do they keep their distance with the Gauss cannon at the cost of slow firing speed? Do they go for the chain gun to mow them down quickly, or the heavy assault rifle to try to conserve ammo? How do they change their strategy if the enemies are flying cacodemons or lumbering mancubi? These are all decisions that need to be made in the blink of an eye in Doom, and the choices the audience makes in those split seconds all come from conclusions spawned from their own unique thought processes.
There's a lot of techniques to get more points, and when you're going after these points, you're constantly putting yourself in jeopardy. So when you see somebody trying to go for a record score or press for more points, that play looks a little more aggressive and reckless as opposed to someone who's just trying to survive and get through the game.
Strategy games like StarCraft or Civilization are similar in how they use their challenges to have the player commit choices and draw conclusions for themselves. What type of army do they feel the most comfortable building with the faction they're playing? Do they go for upgrades or a new production structure next? How do they react if their opponent attacks from the side or the air? Though there are often in-game tutorials that offer advice on how the mechanics work and what the reliable course of action often is, the player is expected to move beyond this and plan for situations that aren't easy to predict. Ultimately, it still comes down to the audience to decide for themselves what to do, and where the path to victory lies. Even something as seemingly juvenile as Mugen, a 1999 freeware fighting game meant to be modified and worked on by the players themselves, can still say something important with the choices it offers. Because of how open-ended the modification system is, people around the world have programmed a number of characters, stages, and more into Mugen. Often they try to either recreate characters from other favorite fighting games, or go for far more unorthodox options. However, none of the options that have been created over the years are mandatory or viewed on any kind of scale of worth. It is completely up to the audience to choose how they want to customize their version of Mugen. The characters they put in, the stages they choose, all of it is purely what they want to see in their own fighting game. Mugen is a perfect example of a game with no restrictions on what the audience wants in it. It is literally up to them what to do with it.
Once upon a time, there was this idea that art existed in this sphere that was untouched and unsullied by the grubby world of money-making and business. Art was in a separate sphere. And that was a long time ago in some ways. And the bubble is drifting closer to the ground at the same time as huge categories of life are becoming part of business. Those art forms that seem very much more like business because of the historical context can just as well be considered art because there's no longer that extreme separation between the sphere of art and the sphere of business.
Video games are an art form with as many genres and subgenres as any other, but what ties them all together is choice. It can be used for grand world-changing, or it can be used for reflex-testing thrills. It can make us laugh, cry, or even both. It can place us in situations so impactful that they get their own genres defining them. No matter what the intent is, all of it relies on us, the audience, to become an active participant in the art form. It has us give ourselves to the characters, art style, and world just like any other storytelling art form, all the while becoming part of what drives it forward. Ultimately, this is what makes them so important to the world of art. Thus, their value is something to be held onto tightly when faced with opposition. Censorship is nothing new, of course. Many art forms have faced this in the past. Books, films, and so on have been banned from the public eye in the interest of keeping people safe from what may only serve to harm the mind. Video games have not been above such treatment either. There are entire lists of them that have been banned in various countries all over the world, being seen as too violent or too poorly tasteful to be shown to the public. And though some did manage to break free years later, many still remain in the dark. Because they are just games, and many think that they will never matter.